Have you wanted to learn more about philosophy and spirituality but felt intimidated by ancient Greek or Sanskrit? Is it too embarrassing to admit that we are more than the body? Are you afraid to bring up reincarnation over coffee? Well, we love coffee, and Plato, Buddhism, and Sri Ramana Maharshi. And we think these teachers and systems have some use today. This is the Beware How program, Mystic Philosophy Made Practical. I'm Bob, speaking weekly with Scott and Ryan. We're three conscious creatives and formerly closeted mystics trying to unpack the inaccessible. According to the mystics, the truth cannot be spoken, but we'll try to talk about it anyway. Hi, I'm Bob Peck, and this is the Beware How program. Today is Wednesday, April 15th. Easter was on Sunday, so we thought it would be a good time to unpack Christianity. As far as the structure for this podcast or episode today, just wanted to start with us talking about our own Christian upbringings, kind of what we enjoyed about it, what ultimately made us disillusioned with it, as we are all three non-churchgoers in our adult life. And then we can discuss a little bit around what mystic Christianity means, a bit about the Gnostics, and some Bible scholarship, some kind of intro to. And lastly, I definitely want to talk a little bit about how the teaching, or the true teaching, italics, can be applied in our lives. So I'll start. Personal story, anecdote, realization section. Wait, I don't have to say that.
Read the outline.
Okay, right. Next bullet. So when I talk about growing up and my Christian background, religious background, I always say we're Easter Christmas Christians. My family went to church twice a year. We went on Easter, we went on Christmas. We were Episcopal in East Texas, and it was my mom's family. My dad's family was Catholic, and my grandmother, my dad's mother, called Episcopals Catholic Light, because it's very similar, like the decorations and the similar kind of rituals and doctrines, etc. More so than Baptists or other Protestant traditions. It's kind of Episcopal. It's Catholics without the Pope. Mm-hmm. I like to say that also we would sing songs we didn't know the words to. We were very enthusiastic about the ritual community process of it. But because we were infrequent visitors, we didn't know all the moves. We didn't know everything. But I really liked going. I really liked going. We would go Christmas Eve and Easter Sunday morning. And it was so fun because you would dress up and, the pastor was really great. The guy I grew up with, Father Padgett, who's in The Kingdom Within. I tracked him down 15 years later, and he's in my documentary. But it was a nice little kind of family ritual, and that's really all it was. And it started to change for me when I would hang out with my best friend, who was Baptist, in East Texas. There's some fervent Christianity. Scott's family, I'm sure you'll talk about your East Texas devout family members as well. But, we would I would hang out with him, play Nintendo 64, Saturday night. And then Sunday morning, whoever was sleeping over, go with, the family to church. And going to those services, I remember being very young and turned off, which sounds like I'm making that up, but I really do remember like the exclusivity piece was really strange and off-putting. Very, very specifically, an old woman asked me at one of the vacation Bible schools for the kids area. This old woman asked me if I wanted to go to hell or if I wanted to go to heaven. And she said, if you want to go to heaven, all you have to do is believe that Jesus Christ is Lord. And once you say that and do that, you're good. And, I was, a third in on cognitive development probably, right? But I specifically remember feeling uneasy about that. Like, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't resonate. It feels like there's more to it. It feels like that's a thin representation of what all this grander stuff is about. Also my dad, but happy to pause there and let you guys share as well.
Go for it, Ryan. I'll let you start off.
Okay, cool. Let's see. I grew up, going to a Protestant Christian church. It was a UCC, United Church of Christ. My whole family went. We went every Sunday, and we went every Sunday until 8th grade, and that was when you'd go through confirmation, and in 8th grade, I chose not to be confirmed, and I think my parents were pretty surprised by that, but they supported me. They were not going to make me do anything I didn't want to do, so I was super, super grateful for that. I actually really did enjoy. There was nothing about the church that turned me off because of the particular church that I went to. I really enjoyed. It was just that I was a middle schooler going into high school, and I had so many other things I would rather do on a Sunday morning than go to church. It just, that's all it was. There wasn't anything that like explicitly turned me off about it. The thing that I am so grateful for and I really enjoy is that at UCC, the United Church of Christ, they accept gay and lesbian people. And so I grew up with elderly gay and lesbian couples at our church. And so I grew up thinking that was totally normal. Like, no one ever in my life told me that that was wrong. Until eventually I feel like at some point in high school, maybe, I guess high school, but probably more so college, once I like left my hometown and I moved to Chicago, and I started to like actually meet a lot of people from all over the world, and realizing that like gay and lesbian couples at church is not normal. And I was really surprised by that. And so I'm just super grateful to have that perspective. I was never once in my life told or taught that being gay or lesbian is wrong. So that was like, and in general, like my church, I loved the pastor. I loved everyone there. Like it was an enjoyable experience. It just was a little bit boring. That's all. There was like, I'd rather stay up late and play video games and sleep in, there's just other things I'd rather do. So, I think that was it really. I don't explicitly remember anything that like necessarily turned me off about it, but
so your rejecting confirmation was because you just had other interests. You were just like, no, I gotta.
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't really related.
It wasn't
to like
a dramatic
stand on the hill.
I'm leaving.
No,
I'm out of this.
Yeah. No,
I'm
and
converting.
It's really interesting too, because like I remember like my friends at church that were my age. I think I remember them being kind of surprised by it, but like also relatively supportive. Like I don't ever remember having a super confrontational conversation about it. Like someone trying to pressure me into it. That never happened. So I am super grateful for all of that. And then I basically, the way that my parents put it was like they wanted us to go to church until 8th grade. And once we got into high school, they gave us the option to go or not. And I never really went again. I too became an Easter Christmas Christian at that point. So I would go on Easter and Christmas with my parents because they really wanted me to be there, and I was happy to be there. I was happy to support them in that, and I did enjoy
on behalf of the Easter Christmas congregation, we welcome you.
Thank you very
The
much.
parking is difficult.
Yeah, lots of cars.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, and so I never went again, and my interest in spirituality didn't pick back up until later in college, and then that's when I really actually kind of went back and started studying Christianity more, and kind of that was the moment that started to form my current perspective on all religions, including Christianity. So, but yeah, that was the core of my kind of upbringing. It was never anything negative, just a little bit boring.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Nice. I'll go next, I guess. I definitely some similarities. I think all three of us were raised in a Christian household, but with parents that were willing to be flexible on, on our decision over the matter. But saying that, I think I went, I guess, the most often out of the three of us. Not that it's a competition, but yeah, no, I was steadily. My mom was raised in Southeast Texas, very devout, churchgoer for pretty much all of her life because that's what her parents did. So she, followed that tradition with us, and we went to Baptist church for most of my childhood. And as I started to get to that middle school, high school age, we kind of started shifting from the like classic Baptist church to the like, the churches that have the guy with the acoustic guitar up front on stage, the friendly, peace-loving Jesus church, as some people might have called it, I guess.
It's called like tattoo Christians.
Okay, I haven't heard
that
one.
term. I don't know. That sounds pejorative. It's not meaning to be.
Yeah, it was. I'm not sure why we started doing that switch, but it was helpful to see other versions of what the sermon looked like, and I actually through high school I was still attending those churches like out of my own will a lot of the times. I did I got into that kind of teaching. Is pretty regular through middle school and high school, and then I started to read. I guess the biggest change for me was reading about Gnostic Christianity in high school, and I still don't know. It might have been you, Bob, that told me about them. That when I did that deep dive, yeah, and that sent me off on a path. But I think I was also pushed away in a sense because I often went to church with my grandparents in Victoria, Texas, and their church was quite a bit different than the South Austin church, as you can imagine. And it wasn't like super negative, but there were definitely it was just a lot stricter. It was a lot more. It felt more exclusionary. It felt more political. The way that their church was run, what they talked about, it felt a lot more. I guess just more. Your kind of classic rural Texas conservative church, and so I had definitely got some bad taste in my mouth from them directly, and just through. Seeing how my grandma kind of took that teaching and like as an example, she definitely does not approve of I have several gay cousins, and she does not we thought it was a win to get her to like show up to the wedding, for example, of one of my cousins, and like that was just seeing that, like seeing what that ideology, how it could like let someone turn on their own family in that way, like really bothered me and still does. And so I guess I got to see multiple angles of like contemporary American Christianity, both from like the South Austin acoustic guitar Jesus guy, and then and then my grandma's like Victoria, Texas church that actually last year, side note, they had to shut down because their congregation got too small and they couldn't run the building anymore. So that happened. And my grandma lives in Austin now, so she's doing her own thing. But anyway, that had a big impact on just kind of seeing both the good and bad sides that of the practice, and then once I found,
I'm glad she came to the wedding.
Yeah,
that's a dub.
It was, we were proud
despite
of her
all the sinning
for doing that. Yeah, she was able to, and she even had a little glass of wine which was another big deal too. Yeah, so she loosened up a tiny bit, but no. But yeah, it was good to see that, and but yeah, that had an influence, and I think just discovering in high school that there were other sides of Christianity that I had not heard of that really appealed to me when I discovered them. That had a big impact, so I kind of just started reading.
Yeah, and that's a great segue too. I mean, I feel silly about how I kind of teased my dad and let it up to you guys, but tying what you guys both said kind of back into his influence on me, and really what I'd like to do too is provide a little context about Austin, Texas, where Ryan and I live and Scott and I grew up. Texas is, for people that don't really know Texas or America, all of Texas is just cowboys and horses, and it's very stereotyped. And Austin is kind of the creative, artistic, open-minded oasis in the middle of it. We have Willie Nelson, and we have Barton Springs. We have, all the artists basically from the 70s in Texas and other states came here and made it kind of a hippie mecca. It's keep Austin weird. And so, it's no surprise that you saw those such severe distinctions in South Austin Church of acoustic guitars to kind of rural Texas, which is totally different. I mean, most of my friends, even in Austin, moved here from other cities in Texas, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas. Pretty much everyone, the vast majority of people that aren't from out of state are from other cities in Texas, because people kind of realize that, and those cities are fine. I like Houston and San Antonio, especially. Dallas is fine, but they tend to be a little more old school and a little more conservative, a little more closed-minded than Austin. Austin is just this, it's just different, and that's why it's been a kind of boom town economically, and had a ton of people move here in the last 10, 20 years. But that also plays into the spirituality, and it's another reason why The Kingdom Within, which is, for context, a film I made that these guys worked on, that you guys did great work on, about yoga and Christianity. Austin was kind of a character in the film because Texas is exactly like you described it, Scott. It is this kind of conservative Christianity, evangelical Baptist, etc. And then Austin is like, there's a yoga studio across from a yoga studio. It's like, it's very, very different and more spiritual, less institutional, things like that. So that's Austin, and that's my dad. My dad is just he was born in San Antonio, but he's lived here his whole life. He's 65, and he was Catholic, turned atheist, turned spiritual, is kind of how he describes it in his look back. And so when I was a kid, I would go to the vacation Bible school with my friend, my mom's town in East Texas in Beaumont. And when I moved here in Austin, and when I was 10 and hung out with my dad more, he had already kind of converted to SBNR, spiritual but not religious, kind of post-atheism. And, that's how I heard about Elaine Pagels and the Gnostic Gospels. And, he was reading Autobiography of a Yogi in the 90s, and A Course in Miracles and all those things. So grateful for his kind of, spiritual foundation of questioning it, of saying, really any time. And I mean, you guys are all 100% there, but you got those inclinations, I think, a long time ago, which is like anytime a system of faith or belief kind of says this is the only way, be careful because there's so many paths and they're all interesting and valid in their own way. And, very early on, he supported my explorations into other things. And Living Buddha, Living Christ was an early one I read, which is a Thich Nhat Hanh. Anytime you compare Buddha and Christ, or Krishna and Christ, or saints across the religions, that's when it got interesting for me too. Finding those parallels and those alternative takes on Christianity. So cool because they're limitless.
Absolutely.
Bob, I was curious, how old was your dad when he moved to Austin?
Well, he was a little kid in Austin.
Okay.
Yeah,
gotcha.
he was like real little, and then went to high school in Dallas, and then moved back for UT, and he's been here.
Yeah, I was just curious because it's like my parents were kind of the like, hippies in the 70s that decided that living in Austin was better than living in like, Beaumont and like Southeast or Point Comfort, Texas. So it, like you said, obviously there's a reason we have similar like, upbringings because we have parents who, gravitated towards that city.
100%. Yeah. And there's generations. I mean, Ryan's in the modern wave, Ryan came here in 2010 ish, right? Something like that. And
2011.
And yeah, I mean it attracts like,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think those kinds of explorations are why I got a bachelor's in religious studies from UT. Went there for film, but I really enjoyed school, and all my electives were in religious classes. And so the fourth year, I went to the counselor and I was probably high. And the guy was like, if you just do one more year and you can get a religious degree also. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, great. Like, sweet. So I did that, and I just did 5 years. And yeah, my concentration was in New Testament, but studied Buddhism and Hinduism and Sufism and shamanism and all those things. And maybe I'll go back again someday, but now with the internet and there's 10,000 books on all this stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think, to you guys' point, the college years are so high school, college, and beyond is really important because that's when you start exploring a bit further. And there's people that this material, this the Beware How program, and really the project as a whole is kind of designed to help, folks, young men and women that are saying, wait a second, is there more to this? And so that's a big kind of thesis of this project as a whole is kind of, awakening out into this larger exploration of the maybe the path that you had an upbringing with by reading Gospel of Thomas or, other faiths and other systems. The one thing that I'll say too, as far as kind of my study of the New Testament in particular was, I had a professor named L. Michael White, he's a pretty big deal. He's not known by really non-academia, but he's been in Nat Geo stuff, and he would be like one of his classes had 300 people, and he would say, hey, the TA is going to be leading this because next week I have to go to Italy for this shoot for this, History Channel, whatever. He was like that kind of guy. And I didn't go to all office hours of my professors, but I went to his. There was only a couple that I would go to, and he was one of them. And so I had a couple of one-on-ones with him. And in his office, he had up on the wall an Austin American Statesman newspaper article, editorial written by some kind of Christian angry pastor, basically, saying, good Christian kids go to UT, liberal UT, and take Professor White's classes, and lose the faith or whatever, and he had that framed on his wall, and it wasn't that wasn't my experience. It was never like believer then goes to university and loses belief. That's such a reductive kind of path. For me, it was it affirmed what a concentration in this material really affirmed for me was the validity of affiliation-less spirituality, and that's what I'd like to talk about in the next section. Happy to share more too from a personal perspective, but as you kind of uncover and really look at these texts, that's what's so exciting about it to me. Is it kind of the institutions get shaky, but the underlying truths really start to brighten up. And that's, and I'm still obsessed 10, 12 years later.
It occurs to me that I don't know why it is, but like most of the people I know who were in the same path as me, like got so turned off by the institution that they still reject everything. And, like my brother included. And it's, I don't know. It's not necessarily all just, like out of, trauma from the institution, but some people are just genuinely atheist and that's fine. But, I don't know what it is that like, I guess we had maybe enough good experiences out of it that we didn't get just like totally shut down. We had a little bit of a thread that kept us going to be like, okay, maybe there is something to it, even though I don't believe what this guy on this stage is saying anymore. Anyway, I just wonder what caused that. But
no, you're right. I mean, I've heard the term post-Christian society, is kind of how you frame 2020 in the developed world. Post-Christian society, it's like church attendance pretty low. It's never been this low, I don't think, in America. And it's because of that experience people have. They kind of lose the institutional upbringing. It's because they're watered down a little bit. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, but I'm not dismissive of institutional religion. I do think it has value for people, but it's not all or nothing, and that's kind of a big question I'm kind of trying to help answer, or at least contribute to, is to say there's a lot of depth, and Terence Mckenna, by the way, who I'm also obsessed with recently, and we'll have a whole thing devoted to him in the future, but, he said something like, to think that it's only, evangelical pastors or hardline humanist scientists, like you're missing massive swaths of philosophy, humanity. It's not black and white, and it's not theism or atheism. There's a lot of currents flowing in between those two chasms. Where the three of us certainly exist. Damn it.
There's more to it.
Yeah, there's more to it. That's really the whole point. This I'm looking at the next quote just to move us along here, and it's dismissive of institution. It's Friedrich Nietzsche who said, "In truth, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross." And I love that quote, and so many people. Mark Twain has a similar variation. By the way, I think there's only one Christian, they killed him or something like that. And people, it's so true because there really does seem to be a difference and a distinction between this really loving figure in that material and how the institution, certainly the institution, has acted. Over the millennia. As a moderator here, I'm just kind of assessing how far we should start jumping into, because, I have a lot to say about it, but also want to let you guys chime in.
Yeah, one thing that's just kind of popping out to me is I know that, especially with our generation, I don't feel like, I know that church attendance is down. Like it's lower than it like ever has been, but I also don't feel that like the general practice of spirituality within our generation is necessarily down. I think it's just a curiosity and a part rebellion against Christianity. I mean, and I guess I'm speaking as an American in America. You know, I mean, Christianity is like the prominent religion, right? And so I find that I have a lot of friends that are genuinely have a spiritual side to them, and maybe they just got turned off by Christianity, and they have not they just haven't really explored it much outside of that, but they're not like completely dismissing it either, you know. And everyone's on their own path, everything comes in time, but I do think like a lot of what's happening is just simply a rebellion against Christianity. I mean, that's what, in terms of, as far as our generation is concerned anyways. I mean, I think, and a lot of that is just, a lot of it feels like it's just kind of caused by the kind of the hypocrisy that we see, right? Like everything that you expect a Christian to be based on the principles of Christ, you don't see it super often from the Christians themselves. And there's a lot of turmoil and a lot of, I think a lot of just, a lot of,
I mean, homophobia too, which you brought up. Both of you guys brought up.
Yeah,
the homophobia thing lost
totally,
a lot of our generation. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. I guess that's just something I wanted to mention, because I feel like there are a lot of people who are still open spiritually, and also like people have their own versions of what they kind of consider spiritual, you know. But I don't know. That's a whole nother conversation we could get into. But but I am hopeful. Like I do think that like the low attendance of churches is a good thing. Like I think it's waking people up, specifically the churches themselves. That, like, you know, our generation is maybe not we're not gonna just kind of fall in line. Like, we're gonna ask questions, you know, and I that's a good thing. That's exciting to me. So
well said.
Yeah, I think I maybe didn't mention it either, but yeah, it's like the people who did get turned off, it's like most of the time conversations about this stuff gets people really angry, and like it does me too. Like, it's hard to see, like, you know, the obvious example are like politicians who claim to be Christian who are just like so blatantly you know, going against those teachings, and yet people will like believe them when they say they're Christian, and that's infuriating, and it's like hard to get past that. And so it's like, for me, doing this is like a way for me to like remember, oh yeah, there are like, you know, valuable things to see past like the like enraging nature of like the hypocrisy, like you said, of like claiming to be a follower of like this incredibly like gentle, you know, loving philosophy, and then turn that around into like hatred is hard to see.
Yeah, one of my professors said that the reason we're talking about Jesus now, 2,000 years later, an illiterate day laborer, I mean, pretty inconsequential from a socioeconomic perspective, to have all that material, to have all, you know, biggest religion in the world 2,000 years later. Why is that? The Christians will say it's because he died for the sins of the world, you know. Duh, there's theological reasons. He said, no, it's not because of that. He said it's because of the way Jesus taught was so radical. Not only were his teachings radical, he said things like, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. You know, the Buddha says something similar a couple of centuries prior, but not a lot of people in the ancient world. Nobody's saying that now. pray for your enemies. I mean, it's a pretty incredible teaching. And, in addition to that, the parables, what really was so cool about the scholarship to me was like, we would spend a week on one parable and really unpack every aspect of it. If you guys will let me, my favorite one is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which made it into the Kingdom Within. I feel like I'm just plugging my old film. But one of the reasons it's such a mind-blowing, people think Good Samaritan, they think the hospital, it's lost its revolutionary component, but it's a very radical teaching. And this is why. In those days, the Jewish religion was obsessed with rules and regulations. A man asked him, he says, love your neighbor as yourself, was the teaching that precedes. And the guy says, what do you mean by neighbor? And he says, well, it's like this. Jesus says, it's like this. A man was traveling on a road to Jericho, and these robbers beat him and left him for dead. He's on the side of the road dying, and one guy walks by, and it's a priest, it's a Jewish priest. He sees the man and doesn't help him. He crosses the road and goes on his way, which is an indictment of the religious authority at the time. For this guy to tell this story, suggesting that religious leadership would not help a wounded person. The reason is because ancient Jewish religion, some modern Jewish religion, is lingers, but particularly in the ancient world, they were obsessed with cleanliness. Cleanliness was holiness, and baptism, kind of water purification. There were rules in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Torah, to avoid dead things, to avoid dirty, So what the priest did was he kind of just assumed that the guy was dead in order to not break the law, in order to not, bring about repercussions for himself, for his community. And a second man comes along. It's a Levite who's a priest assistant kind of figure. Does the same thing. Sees the man who appears to be dead, crosses the road, and goes on his way. A third person comes, who's a Samaritan. Samaria neighbored Judea, so they were the way that my professor explained it was they were like an ethnic outcast. Basically, they were kind of, the Jews and the Samaritans were not cool. And the Samaritan comes along. He doesn't follow the rules of the Jewish religion. He sees the man, is injured. He's not quite dead. Puts him on his donkey, takes him to the next, town, and gives the guy 2 denarii, which is a lot of money. So it implies he might have been a tax collector. That's disputed, but which is kind of another layer of like kind of glamorizing, glorifying a villainous character, quote unquote. But he says, spend this money, bring this guy back to health. If you spend any more, I'll be back tomorrow later and I'll cover you, just heal this man. And Jesus says, which person did the right thing? And the crowd doesn't even say the Samaritan. The crowd says the third person, because they're unwilling to admit that the despised Samaritan versus their own religious authority would do the right thing. So there's a ton of meaning in that. And, it's why the Jewish authority wasn't a big fan of him. They led to his demise. Or contributed to his demise. The Romans ultimately are responsible, but the Jewish authority wasn't a big fan of him, and that's why. It's because he was actually calling out religious hypocrisy in the same way that we were earlier, to say that there are people that kind of follow the law and or talk about following these rules, and they're actually, what they're doing is they're overlooking the human aspect, the connective aspect, the harmonious aspect of spirit, of Scripture. of truth, of connectedness, of all these things. And they're getting lost in, it's been corrupted. In many ways, he was kind of a, reformer, an institutional critic. And so what, to my professor's point, to say why we're still talking about this guy, teachings like that would have just imagine the jaws on the floor of the hill of, where the people were listening to him say something like that. They couldn't believe that this guy was talking like that. So, you don't really get that on Sunday. I mean, all that kind of scholarly investigation and context of like the cultural stuff. To me, that was like such a cool thing, because he's doing, what a lot of us are doing now. We don't like the hypocrisy of the institutions. We think that there's a love aspect that's the true component of spirituality that's missing. And, so I just got even more into him post, these kinds of explorations.
Mm. It's a simple parable. Obviously we've heard it. It's funny. It's like, I enjoyed hearing it again because, like you said, it's like the term Good Samaritan is so like ubiquitous, but like you kind of forget where it came from. But it's like, like just a simple story like that could like send shockwaves through the ancient world when, it was just not at all what people were used to hearing, and still is not necessarily as common. I'd like to think it's more common now, but maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's just one example. I mean, there's tons.
Yeah.
A big thing too, I think that we should point out, as far as kind of the validity of the materials, that Bart Ehrman lecture that I linked to you guys, that I will link in the description. I'll link these sources. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament professor who's probably the most public facing. He's written a couple of books that he does kind of what scholars don't do well, which is sell to the public. And he gave a lecture about the inconsistencies. I think in addition to what scholarship does in getting to the true meaning, what it also does is dismiss the claim of infallibility, which is what religious, conservative and fundamentalist Christians will say. Every word in the Bible is true, is a common kind of thing. And even, people that I know and love and care about have shared that with me. And it's not factual. And the reason it's not factual is because we don't have, essentially this is what Ehrman says. We don't have the originals. We have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of the originals. The earliest dated papyrus that we have is 200. I think P52 is like 140 or 125 or something like that. It's the earliest papyrus of the New Testament gospel we have, and it's mid-2nd century. It's still 100 years after Jesus' death. And the way he explains it, which is really helpful, is, if you had a copy of a book in the ancient world, you had to copy by hand. The printing press was Gutenberg was 15 something, I don't know. But a few centuries later, right? And, people make mistakes. If you sat down with the Gospel of Mark and wrote it out by hand, it probably wouldn't be exactly accurate. And what happened over the centuries is the mistakes were copied, and the mistakes were copied, and the mistakes were copied, and more were made, etc. And, we just, from a mathematical, statistical perspective, there was a guy, John Mill, who he talks about this in the lecture, who had about 100 different manuscripts of the New Testament in, I want to say 1600, something like that. And, when they were trying to decide which ones to print, he would compare them, and he made footnotes. And there were, according to this guy 500 years ago, with the 100 manuscripts he had, 30,000 differences. total between the 100 manuscripts that he owned and was printing. And now we have about 5,700 manuscripts total globally. Some are complete, some aren't, some are just little scraps. But we don't know how many differences there are in the 5,700s. Even with computers, we don't have a way to calculate it. The estimate is around 200 to 400,000 differences between the existing manuscripts we have. He says the way that he likes to explain it is there are more differences between the manuscripts that we have than there are words in the New Testament. So that's the context for why the infallibility doctrine is a fanatical dream. I mean, it doesn't have any validity in the source material, in the textual material that we have. So that's a really important foundation to start. If you can start there and say, okay, there's a lot of differences and variations within this, then let's start to unpack it, and then let's start to really comb through it and find where the value is, which is what we should move into here on kind of the practical side. But it's what I wanted to do here, at least today, is talk about like why Bible scholarship is so interesting to me. It's because it's an intro into untangling the most popular document in the world. I would leave those classes and walk out and see a flyer for a church thing. And, it was so relevant to understand this material because it's affected the Western world and the world at large so much. But to really untangle it and try to understand it is just a lot of fun.
Yeah. One of my English teachers in high school, she was a really cool lady. I remember saying, I remember her saying that the variety that you find in the texts is like an ocean to swim through, and like you can kind of determine whatever you want within that text. But she also said that like whether you're Christian or not, atheist, whatever, it's like important to understand the text because like so much modern fiction and just everything has been like based on a lot of those old parables and things. So yeah, like you said, there's like an incredible like historical and just like cultural weight behind the text as
you're gonna miss some references if you don't know. It's foundational for a lot of literary, artistic,
right,
painting, art, music. I mean, there's a lot of foundational stuff that comes out of them. And, I think the other thing, too, to mention, and I realized we should do in the future, I don't want to, go, do a bunch of Christian stuff all the time. As far as, the brand of this thing, it's not supposed to be about this. I just wanted to talk about our upbringings and started to unravel it all. But we should definitely do a thing on
Easter
Thomas.
relevant.
This is Easter relevant. That's right. We should do a thing on Gnostics and Gospel of Thomas in the future, few down the line. But just to tease, if you don't know what this stuff is, we found these books in 1945. Egyptian shepherd stumbled on a jar it was the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century. And the Gospel of Thomas is in there, Gospel of Philip's in there. Very, very early stuff is in there. Gospel of Truth. And then some later ones. There's some later derivative ones that are crazy, and they're not. Like the Acts of Thomas is funny. It's doesn't make any sense. But there's early ones also, and they're very important. You might even say Gospel of Thomas predates the Gnostics. That's how early it is. But it offers an additional view to that Jesus portrayed in Paul's letters and the four Gospels of the New Testament. There's healthy scholarly debate on the dating of Thomas. But, I mean, the most extreme say it's as early as Mark, which is the earliest Gospel. Pretty much the most conservative scholars will date it at around John, 100 to 120. So pretty much the entire spectrum of Bible scholarship considers it in the timeline of the four Gospels that we've had for 2,000 years. We've only had this one for, 70. So it's been difficult for people to untangle because it is so far out. I mean, it's esoteric. About half of the sayings are in Matthew and Luke, and about half of them completely new. So just wanted to tease Thomas a little bit and tease the Gnostic portrayal of Jesus and just say, look, this guy, we knew they existed also because we had church correspondence. We had early church fathers. Irenaeus, for example, wrote against heresies. It was like his life's work. He was just saying why the Gnostics are wrong. 5 volumes of just how wrong these guys are. But we knew the titles and we knew the material kind of ish, but we didn't have them until last century. So it's very important that particularly Christians, investigate it. I'm not saying that these texts have all the answers. I'm not saying that, I am saying it's a revolutionary discovery and it's worth, spiritual people especially who like that Galilean man, which I do, kind of look into them. So we'll just tease it there. I think what I wanted to spend the last... Oh, go ahead.
I would love to do an episode on Gnostic Christianity and the Gospel
cool.
of Thomas. And,
let's do it.
I would love to do an episode on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's esoteric. It's called The Secret. The intro says this is the secret teachings. So what Elaine Pagel says is Mark is the public teaching. It's like the parables and blessed are the peacemakers, things like that. That's Matthew and Luke. But and that Thomas is the disciple stuff. You kind of have public facing and student facing. And that's how spiritual teachers teach, the congregation, the public, lay people. There's kind of a simpler message. But then to the closer students that are studying it, living in it, the disciples, etc., you can be a little more advanced. And that's all, that could be what Thomas is. And so what does Thomas say? What does it imply? It does say about the light is within and make the two one, which could be a non-dual thing. So anyway, we'll tease that. We'll come back to it. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Lastly, I think just wanted to make it practical. We have 15 minutes left. About just applying the teaching and, I think what I have here is, at least for me and in my interpretation, the teaching isn't necessarily to admire this figure from afar, but to imitate him. There's a famous document, or a famous book, I should say, by Thomas A. Kempis, a few centuries ago. I don't remember exactly, but it's a few centuries old, called The Imitation of Christ. The idea that he was an example, and which is not necessarily mainstream. I mean, both Catholicism and Protestantism and Orthodox Christianity, we worship him as the King and the Son, and he did his job, and he very well could be coming back. I mean, there's a variety of interpretations, but the imitation of is kind of more mystical, more contemplative. I might even say it's more Eastern, as far as kind of the Buddha's quest for enlightenment, Hindus breaking samsara with moksha, etc. Imitating Christ. Even John, the Gospel of John in the Bible, one of the canonical Gospels, there's the quote, "But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to those who believe in his name." Sons of God, plural, implying that, he might not necessarily be the sole capital S son, but that it's kind of this process of, through our work, through our own internal work, by living in a loving way, by behaving like the Samaritan does and treating others with love and generosity and compassion and so on, we can kind of climb the evolutionary ladder. Okay, that's not in anything. That's more spiritual new age, but they say like Christ consciousness is one thing I wrote there. New Agers and kind of Hindu spiritual type folks, us mystics over here that have Yogananda on the bookshelf, Christ consciousness or cosmic consciousness, this idea that he exhibited this this capacity that is within all of us, and by imitating him, we can shine our own light.
Yeah, I think it's an easy way to break it down in a really simple way is just like prioritizing imitation versus like admiration, which I mean, not that you can't admire, obviously you have to admire someone that you're trying to imitate, but like
certainly do,
yeah.
But
that's like the trap I saw so many people fall in during my Christian upbringing is like focusing on the like, well, do you admire him? Are you going to say that he's the only one? And if not, then,
right.
I'm going to argue with that, and I'm going to get mad, and I'm going to, some people even take that to like violence and like that, which negates the imitation, like, of course he would not do that himself. So just like remembering that difference, and like, and I would hear Christians themselves say how incredibly hard it is to like meet his standard, to try to do, to try to live the way he did. And so like they admit, they know what they need to do, but like, it's just so easy to get sucked into the other side of like, are you going to say he's Lord? And if not, you're going to hell. And like, that's just, that's the
totally
other side.
What you just reminded me of was the WWJD. Remember that? I loved that.
Same.
I was like, this is great. Finally, we're focusing on
we've made
actions that, how can we kind of replicate?
Yeah.
Even though it's like a corny 90s wristband or whatever.
Yeah. No, they brought it up.
It was
what
a cool
was
kind of
true,
movement.
Though, like, yeah, absolutely. That was like, I think that is absolutely what every Christian should be asking themselves in every single moment. What would Jesus do? Like, yeah.
Yeah, there's little glimmers.
I do that with, Jesus and other teachers. And I often try and find, when I find myself in difficult situations, try and take the perspective of my teachers, right? Like, what would they do? Like, how would they handle this? And yeah, I think we should bring WWJD back as well.
I love it. I heard
a guy earlier this week talk about that, I guess having to do with the Easter Sunday service, and he's not a religious figure, but he brought that up again, the WWJD, and then he asked which Jesus, because he was talking about and he was actually making parallel, because he works in like civil rights and stuff. So
gun owner Jesus, or
yeah, well, he was making parallels to MLK and the way that both of them are often kind of like glamorized or like mainstreamed, whereas the version that often gets forgotten is like the more radical revolutionary version of like those. So yeah, that's
a great question too.
Yeah, I agree that it's
particularly
it's
the
a right
Gospels
question to ask.
themselves.
It leads to other questions. Yeah.
I mean, another point here within Bible scholarship is the Jesus of Mark would not recognize the Jesus of John. That's an important point to call out also, as far as like gospel portrayals. He has a failed miracle in Mark. He can't heal a daughter. A man brings his daughter to him, and he tries to heal her and can't, and then says this kind can only be healed through prayer, something like that. And that one ain't in the later. Mark's the earliest. That one ain't in the later ones. Yeah. There's a book around here somewhere called Gospel Parallels, which is like a standard kind of New Testament scholarship, reference book, and they'll put passages from each book. They're not all the same. Even, I mean, there's only a few passages that are in even 3 of them. A few of them are only in 2, and some of them are exclusive. But they'll put them next to each other, and so you can see kind of what you might call the evolution of particularly the kingly image. Like in the earlier, it's date-wise, it's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Mark is 60 to 70, Matthew is 70, 75, 80, Luke is 80 to 90, John is 100, 120. You can see the passage get kinglier. You'll see like the line will be like, and then the teacher, walked off the boat and came up on the shore and started teaching it. And then like by the time you get to John, it's like the adoring crowds of the king knelt, you can see that take place over time. Which in a way does build up the admiration side of it than the imitation. Mm-hmm. The kingliness is does make the distinction between us and them. And frankly, again, to tease the Gnostic episode, the big reason why they were called heretics was, and blasphemers for the last 2,000 years, we're kind of getting at that here, guys, which is, do we have that capacity in ourselves to become, like Christ? And, I think the Hindus, of course, that's the whole point, is to break the cycle of birth and death. We have masters like Jesus of Nazareth, who's on every Hindu temple's altar, by the way, as a living example of someone who was born a man, but, through his own trials and tribulations, transcended, even in Yogananda's autobiography of a Yogi, which was such a important text for all three of us. Chapter 44 is the resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. A couple months after Yogananda buried his guru, he's sitting in a hotel room, and he materialized. And Sri Yukteswar, they go on for half an hour and have a conversation. Yogananda hugs him. Sri Yukteswar explains the cosmic things that happened in his life and how kind of the astral realms work and what will happen and things like that. Very, Christ-like, so to speak, where he materializes and then disappears. And, this is getting pretty esoteric toward the end, but, the idea is we're not the body. If we're spirit, if we're light, then it's not that big a deal. The Christians make a really big deal out of Jesus' resurrection, and, I think you should. Pretty impressive to manipulate the atomic structure, but it's possible by breaking the wheel. I think that's what the mystic traditions, that's what the Eastern traditions are about, is transcendence and kind of overcoming. And really Easter in general, to tie it all back in, Yogananda's commentary on the Bible, he wrote a 2-volume commentary called The Second Coming of Christ, The Resurrection Within You. The message of Easter, the why I get so jazzed about Easter as a kind of universalist mystic, is because this man transcended. He overcame the body. He overcame, our past selves. It's redemptive. It's a reminder, and of course, the Miracles will say this too. It's a reminder that we are eternal spirit, that we're that we transcend the body, and Christianity, the institution of the religion of, is very body focused. Worship the body of, take a sacrament of the body. Blood, wine is the blood. It's very focused, Corpus Christi, body of Christ. It's very body focused, whereas mystics, Gnostics, Eastern, etc., don't give that much significance to it. So that is a big difference to call out. If we're making the distinction between, admiration and imitation, take it a step further, and you kind of get to what's the human potential, I guess, is kind of evolution of human, neo-human. Is it body transcendence? Because the spiritualists would say he did it, and let's honor him for that and imitate that.
Yeah, and the mystic.
But a Christian would say, I'm not Christ. I can't,
Yeah, and that. Yeah, so it's like a mystic perspective takes that further to say not only imitation, but that that is your path forward, is to fulfill that imitation. I don't know how, there's probably a better way to say that, but like there's a point other than just like do your best, in the imitation. It's like we are of the same ilk, we are headed in that same direction that both him and the other Hindu avatars and the others that have claimed that resurrection, like that's what they're all saying. That's what they've all been saying, is like, that's where you're headed to. And so like, try to live like these people did,
exactly,
to break that wheel.
Yeah, it's possible because they did it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what generosity what gratitude I feel for the masters of humanity, of men and women throughout the ages, who have broken their chains and left us some instruction on how they did it. I mean, that's the mystic read, is that all these luminaries over time, when they break it, when you break it, I'm speaking hypothetically because I ain't broken it, but they want to share it because your love, like you break down all of the unlovingness of you, and you're just capital L love, and that gets shared either through teaching or service or whatnot, because you're one. I mean, Thomas too. I mean, we'll talk about this in the future, but Thomas, there's lines like "You are me and I am you," and things like that, where it's a oneness. It's an inherent unity between all beings. That's really the beauty. That's really the pearls that connects all these teachings, and it's a shame too, in a way, and that's why I'm so motivated by this project, is to really talk about that in a way that is not proselytizing, but exciting. I mean, I am excited about this stuff. I am enthusiastic about it because it's just, what else is there to talk about? I mean, these people have broken birth and death, and or at least that's the view, and they've done it in all these different variety of ways. And this guy was really the most famous guy that did it. It's a shame to me that people like your brother Scott, who's brilliant, and he's an artist, he's a genius. He's not alone. So many people were so turned off by the hypocrisy that they didn't investigate this stuff fuller. And I think it would be so cool to kind of just be like, hey, actually, there's more to it. That's really my thesis. My thesis isn't quite that we're only spirit. I'm not quite there yet. I can't speak purely experientially to say we're all going to transcend. And, I think that's true. But really my thesis from my heart is, there's a lot underneath. And by investigating this stuff and living in this kind of material in the way that this material talks about across these systems, there's a lot of benefit. There's a lot of joy. Do your best is the start, but it keeps going. Do your best is the beginning. Treat others as they want to be treated. Golden rule in every religion. It's a great start. It's the very beginning, and that's fantastic. But as you do that, there's advances that come. There's new plateaus that come, and new valleys. But yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Love it.
All right. I gotta go feed the baby. Gotta go do the dishes.
Yeah.
Well, didn't really mean to get so damn mystical at the end, but can't help it. Can't help it. It's too much time with this stuff. But thank you guys, and thanks for sharing about your upbringing, and hopefully people can relate to you good Christian boys that left the faith and found a new peace of mind and love and acceptance.
See,
And
I don't think I
I'll
left
link
the
these
faith. I don't
these
think any of us
sources
left the
and
faith.
well, that's true. I told my dad that. I
Yeah.
said, non-Christians like me. I said that to my dad.
Yeah.
He was like, wait. He's like, you think yourself a non-Christian? He's like, you do the food bank stuff and you know the Bible more than anybody.
Yeah.
And it's
Right.
it's
Yeah.
semantics because
Yeah.
I still I mean, the teachings of Jesus Christ are very important to me.
well, he lives in
Yeah.
my
Like,
heart. Yeah, he lives in
Right.
my heart, but
Yeah.
it's the whole exclusivity stuff and Gandhi isn't
Yeah.
burning in hell type of stuff. It's like,
yeah.
I usually say that like by most
So
most Christians' definitions, I am not one, but that
right. That's a great way to frame it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like when people
Probably
say
a
Christian,
good
they
way to
think,
frame it.
died for
Yeah.
our sins, which is one we didn't really talk about. Maybe we'll talk about that one in the Thomas one. But yeah, no, it's all just labels, which the mystics
Yeah.
are not into concepts anyway, because form is problematic.
Yeah.
But anywho, cool. Well, I'll send you guys this, and we don't have a sign off. The sign off is just, well, what was I saying? That was pretty good at the end. There's more to it.
Yeah.
There's more to it all. Is all. What you think it is the initial steps.
Mhm.
There's more unraveling to be had, and hopefully we'll continue to do that every week on this program. Alrighty, thanks guys. I'll shoot you all these files.
All right. Sounds good, man. Good to
brother.
talk.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.